The thunder of hooves was the only warning before bullets splintered the stagecoach window, sending glass shards raining over Grace Thompson's silk skirt. Her scream caught in her throat as the Concord coach lurched violently to one side, nearly tossing her into the lap of Mrs. Higgins, the banker's wife who now clutched her pearls with white-knuckled terror. "God Almighty, it's the Riker Gang!" shouted the driver from above, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire and pounding hooves. Colorado Territory, 1873, was no place for a Boston-bred schoolteacher, Grace was rapidly discovering. 6 days into her journey west to Pikes Peak, where a teaching position awaited, she found herself in the middle of the very danger her father had warned about before she boarded the eastbound train. "Stop the coach, or we'll kill every last one of you," a gruff voice called out, followed by more gunshots that splintered the wooden frame inches from Grace's head. The stagecoach slowed. The thunder of pursuing horses grew louder, surrounding them on all sides. Grace clutched her reticule to her chest, fingers trembling against the cool metal of the small derringer her father had insisted she carry. Its single shot would do little against the band of outlaws now circling the coach like wolves. "Ladies, remain calm," said Mr. Peterson, the silver-haired mining investor seated across from Grace. His weathered face betrayed his own fear despite his steady voice. "They likely only want the strongbox. Give them no trouble, and they'll be on their way." The coach jerked to a halt, dust billowing through the broken window. Grace coughed, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth as the door was wrenched open. A bearded man with a red bandana covering the lower half of his face pointed a revolver into the coach. "Out! All of you now!" he barked. Grace was the last to exit, her legs nearly giving way as she stepped down. 5 men on horseback surrounded them, all armed, all with faces partially hidden. The driver and shotgun messenger already stood with their hands raised, the latter bleeding from his shoulder. "Well, what have we here?" The tallest outlaw, presumably the leader, dismounted and approached Grace. His eyes, cold blue beneath the shadow of his hat, assessed her with unconcealed interest. "You're a long way from wherever you came from, pretty lady." "The strongbox is up top," the driver said hurriedly. "Take it and leave us be." "Oh, we'll take the strongbox," the leader said, not taking his eyes off Grace, "and perhaps something extra for our troubles." Cold dread washed over Grace as he reached for her arm, his dirty fingers grasping the fine fabric of her traveling dress. "No," she gasped, pulling back. "You're coming with us, schoolmarm," he sneered, noticing the book of grammar still clutched in her other hand. "Could use someone to teach my boys some manners." Mrs. Higgins sobbed as 2 outlaws began checking the passengers for valuables, roughly removing Mr. Peterson's pocket watch and Mrs. Higgins' pearl necklace. "Please," Grace pleaded, trying to wrench her arm free. "I'm expected in Pikes Peak. There will be people looking for me." The outlaw laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "By the time they come looking, you'll be long gone." He dragged her toward his horse, Grace struggling with every step. Her heart hammered against her ribs, panic making her limbs weak. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. A single gunshot cracked through the air, followed by the sharp ping of metal striking metal. The leader's horse reared in surprise as its reins, tied to a nearby juniper bush, were suddenly severed by a bullet. "Let her go, Riker." The voice came from atop a ridge to their right. All heads turned to see a lone rider silhouetted against the bright sky, rifle still raised from the shot. "God damn it," muttered the outlaw, still gripping Grace's arm. "Vance Garrison." The newcomer urged his palomino down the ridge at a controlled pace, rifle balanced across his saddle, ready but not threatening. As he drew closer, Grace could make out a lean, sun-bronzed face beneath a dust-covered black Stetson. His faded blue shirt was partially hidden by a brown leather vest, and a sheriff's star glinted on his chest. "This don't concern you, Garrison," Riker called out, though his grip on Grace's arm had slackened slightly. 5 men holding up a Wells Fargo coach in my county concerns me plenty, the rider replied, bringing his horse to a stop 30 feet away. His voice was quiet but carried clearly across the distance. Let the lady go, and maybe I'll let you ride out of here. Riker's laugh was strained. You and what army, Sheriff? Last I counted, you're outnumbered 5-1. Vance Garrison's face remained impassive. Way I see it, I only need to shoot one of you. The rest can decide if they want to join him. His eyes, a startling green that Grace could now see clearly, shifted to her briefly. You all right, madam? Before she could answer, Riker yanked her roughly in front of him, using her as a shield. Drop your rifle, Garrison, or I'll put a bullet in her pretty head. Grace felt the cold press of a revolver barrel against her temple and closed her eyes, certain her decision to leave Boston had led to her death in this dusty stretch of nowhere. That's a coward's move, Riker, the sheriff said, his tone unchanged. Even for you. 5 seconds to drop your weapon, Riker snarled. The sheriff slowly lowered his rifle and Grace felt a surge of despair. But instead of setting the weapon down, in one fluid motion, he fired. The bullet whizzed past Grace's ear so close she could feel its passage disturb her hair and struck Riker's right shoulder. The outlaw roared in pain, his grip loosening. Grace wrenched herself away, dropping to the ground and rolling beneath the stagecoach as gunfire erupted around her. From her position, she could see boots moving, hear the shouts and curses of men engaged in battle. A horse galloped past, riderless. Then, suddenly, silence fell. Grace held her breath, afraid to move. It's safe now, madam, came the sheriff's voice. You can come out. Cautiously, Grace crawled from beneath the coach. The scene before her was one of controlled chaos. 2 outlaws lay on the ground, one clutching his leg, the other motionless. The remaining 3, including Riker, were mounted, hands raised, with the shotgun messenger now holding a revolver on them despite his wounded shoulder. The sheriff dismounted in one smooth movement and approached Grace. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against harsh sun rather than age. Are you hurt? He asked, his gaze assessing her with professional concern. No, Grace managed, brushing dust from her skirt with shaking hands. Thank you. Vance Garrison, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Sheriff of Silverdale County. Grace Thompson, she replied. I was on my way to Pikes Peak for a teaching position. He nodded, then turned his attention to the other passengers. Anyone else injured? After confirming that the passengers were shaken but largely unharmed, Sheriff Garrison efficiently organized the capture of the outlaws. The wounded were tended to, the dead outlaw's body respectfully covered, and the 3 remaining members of the Riker Gang bound securely. We'll take these men back to Silverdale, Garrison informed the driver. It's only about 5 miles east. Your passengers can rest there before continuing on tomorrow. Might be for the best, the driver agreed, examining the damage to his coach. Got a wheel that needs fixing anyway. As they prepared to depart, Sheriff Garrison approached Grace once more. Miss Thompson, if you don't mind riding with me, my horse is steadier than that damaged coach. Grace hesitated, looking at the Palomino with trepidation. Despite growing up around her father's horses in Boston, she had never been comfortable riding. Sensing her unease, the sheriff added, I'll keep you safe, madam. You have my word. Something in his steady gaze convinced her. Grace nodded and allowed him to help her onto his horse before he mounted behind her. The warmth of his chest against her back was simultaneously unsettling and reassuring as they began the journey to Silverdale, the stagecoach following behind and the captured outlaws walking in front, guarded by the shotgun messenger. Been sheriff long? Grace asked, attempting to distract herself from both the precariousness of her position and the odd flutter in her stomach every time the horse's movement pressed her against the solid form behind her. 3 years, he replied. Before that, I rode with the army. 7th Cavalry under Custer, though I left before the troubles with the Sioux got worse. And before that? Virginia, originally. Left after the war when there wasn't much left for me there. His tone discouraged further questions about his past, so Grace shifted topics. What's Silverdale like? Small. Decent. Growing since the silver strike last year. There was a pause before he added, Got a school, but no teacher at present. I'm already promised to Pike's Peak, Grace replied, though a small part of her wondered what it might be like to stay in a town protected by this man. Pike's Peak's lost, then, he said simply, and fell silent for the remainder of the journey. Silverdale appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, nestled in a valley with mountains rising dramatically behind it. Unlike the rough mining camps Grace had heard about, this town had the beginnings of permanence. Proper wooden buildings lined the main street, with a church steeple visible at one end and what appeared to be a new brick building at the other. That's the courthouse, Sheriff Garrison explained, following her gaze. Built it last year after the silver strike brought more people and more trouble. They rode directly to the jailhouse, a solid stone building with iron bars on the windows. 2 men emerged as they approached a young deputy with an eager expression and an older man with a star matching Garrison's. Found the Riker Gang, I see, the older man called out, eyeing the prisoners. They found me, more like, Garrison replied. Frank, get these men secured. Riker's shoulder needs tending. Will do, Sheriff. The deputy gestured for the outlaws to move toward the jail. Sheriff Garrison dismounted and reached up to help Grace down, his hands strong but gentle on her waist. Miss Thompson, this is Marshal Wade Thornton. Marshal, Miss Grace Thompson, on her way to Pike's Peak to teach. The marshal tipped his hat. Madam, looks like you had quite an adventure. One I hope not to repeat, Grace said with a small smile. I'll take Miss Thompson to the hotel, Garrison told the marshal. The stagecoach passengers will need rooms for the night. The marshal nodded and turned his attention to the arriving coach, while Sheriff Garrison offered Grace his arm and led her down the main street toward a 2-story building with Silver Summit Hotel painted in elegant script across its facade. Mrs. Winters runs the place, he explained as they approached. Widowed during the war, came west with her brother. Runs the cleanest establishment in 3 counties. The hotel interior was indeed impressively clean, with polished wooden floors and actual wallpaper, a luxury Grace hadn't expected to see this far west. Mrs. Winters, a plump, pleasant-faced woman in her 50s, emerged from a back room at the sound of the bell over the door. Sheriff Garrison, she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. Don't often see you in here this time of day. Stagecoach was hit by the Riker Gang about 5 miles out, he explained. Passengers will need rooms for the night. This is Miss Thompson. Mrs. Winters' expression shifted immediately to concern. Oh, you poor dear. Are you hurt? Come sit down at once. I'll bring you some tea. Before Grace could protest, she was ushered to a comfortable chair in the small sitting room adjacent to the front desk, and Mrs. Winters disappeared through a door, promising refreshments. I should get back to the jail, Sheriff Garrison said, lingering awkwardly by the hotel entrance. Make sure Riker and his men are secured. Of course, Grace replied, suddenly wishing he would stay longer. Thank you again, Sheriff. You saved my life today. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. Just doing my job, madam. I'll check on you and the other passengers later. With that, he was gone, and Grace was left with an odd emptiness that had nothing to do with the danger she had escaped. Mrs. Winters returned with tea and fresh biscuits, clucking sympathetically as Grace recounted the day's events. That Vance Garrison, the older woman said with obvious affection, is the finest man to ever wear a badge in these parts. Single-handedly cleaned up this town after the mining started bringing in all sorts of rough characters. He seems very capable, Grace agreed, sipping her tea and hoping her warming cheeks weren't visible. Capable and kind, though he keeps to himself mostly, Mrs. Winters continued. Lost his family in the war, from what I hear, though he never speaks of it. Later, settled in a surprisingly comfortable room with an actual porcelain wash basin, another luxury Grace hadn't expected, she found herself standing at the window, watching the activity on the main street below. Her gaze kept drifting toward the jailhouse, visible at the far end. The stagecoach was scheduled to depart the following afternoon, once repairs were completed. Pike's Peak was still her destination, the teaching position still awaited her, and yet, something about Silverdale, or perhaps someone in Silverdale, made her wonder about the path not taken. The sound of the dinner bell interrupted her thoughts. Grace smoothed her travel-wrinkled dress as best she could and headed downstairs, where she found the other passengers already seated in the hotel's small dining room. "Miss Thompson!" Mrs. Higgins called out, gesturing to an empty chair beside her. "We were just discussing our extraordinary rescue. What a fortunate thing that Sheriff Garrison happened to be in the vicinity." "Indeed," Grace agreed, taking the offered seat. "Not fortune at all," said Mr. Peterson, cutting into a piece of beef. "I heard from the deputy that they'd been tracking the Riker Gang for 2 weeks. Sheriff got word they were planning to hit the Wells Fargo line and had been patrolling the route. However it happened, I'm simply grateful," Grace said. "I dread to think what might have occurred otherwise." The hotel door opened and Sheriff Garrison himself entered, hat in hand. He nodded to the room at large and approached their table. "Evening, folks. Just checking to make sure you're all settled comfortably." "Quite comfortably, Sheriff, thanks to you," Mr. Peterson said, raising his water glass in a toast. "Repairs to the coach should be finished by noon tomorrow," Garrison informed them. "You'll be able to continue to Pike's Peak then." His eyes met Grace's briefly, and she thought she detected something like regret in them, though it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Sheriff, won't you join us for dinner?" Mrs. Higgins asked. "Thank you, madam, but I need to get back to the jail. Just wanted to make sure you were all taken care of." With another touch to his hat brim, he departed, leaving Grace with the distinct impression that he had come specifically to see her, though he had addressed his comments to the entire party. After dinner, while the others retired to their rooms, Grace found herself restless. The day's events kept replaying in her mind the terror of the holdup, the moment when Riker grabbed her arm, and the unexpected appearance of Sheriff Garrison on the ridge, like something from one of the dime novels her youngest brother secretly read. On impulse, she retrieved her shawl and stepped outside onto the hotel's small porch. The night air was cool and clear, the stars more numerous and brilliant than she had ever seen in Boston. The town was mostly quiet, though light and piano music spilled from the saloon down the street. "Couldn't sleep." Grace started at the voice, turning to find Sheriff Garrison standing at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. He had removed his dusty vest and washed, his damp hair suggesting a recent bath. "I thought you'd return to the jail," she said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I did. Then I came back." He climbed 2 steps, still leaving a respectful distance between them. "Sometimes after a day like today, sleep doesn't come easy." "No, it doesn't." She studied him in the lamplight spilling from the hotel windows. Without the intensity of danger surrounding them, she could appreciate the strong lines of his face, the quiet confidence in his bearing. "How did you learn to shoot like that? The way you hit those reins without harming anyone?" A small smile touched his lips. "Lots of practice, madam. In my line of work, knowing when not to shoot is as important as knowing when to." Grace hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "Mr. Peterson said you knew the stagecoach would be attacked, that you'd been tracking the Riker Gang." Garrison nodded. "That's right. Got word they were planning something, but wasn't sure exactly where or when they'd strike. I've been patrolling the routes for days." "Then I'm doubly grateful you were there." She took a step closer to the railing, closer to him. Have you always wanted to be a lawman? No. He looked away briefly, toward the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. After the war, I drifted, tried ranching for a spell in Kansas, did some scouting for the army. Badge found me here when the last sheriff was killed in a bank robbery. Town council asked me to step in temporarily. 3 years later, I'm still here. Do you like it? Silverdale, I mean. He considered the question seriously. It's home now. Good people, for the most part, growing in the right ways. He looked back at her. What about you, Miss Thompson? Always wanted to be a teacher? Grace smiled. Since I was a girl, my father wanted me to make a suitable match in Boston society, but I wanted something more purposeful. Teaching gives me that. Pikes Peak will be lucky to have you. There was something in his voice. A note of sincerity mixed with that same hint of regret she'd noticed earlier. Sheriff, she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. Vance, he corrected gently. Just Vance, when I'm not officially sheriffing. Vance, she repeated, liking the sound of it. I'm Grace. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the night sounds of crickets and distant piano music the only accompaniment to their thoughts. Would you like to walk a bit? He asked suddenly. The town's safe enough with me, and sometimes movement helps settle the mind after a day like today. Grace knew she should decline. A proper Boston lady would never walk alone with a man she had just met, regardless of his position. But she wasn't in Boston anymore, and the day's events had left her feeling reckless in a way she never had before. I would like that, she said, descending the steps to join him. He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength beneath the cotton shirt sleeve. They walked slowly down the main street, Vance pointing out buildings of interest to the new school, currently closed due to the lack of a teacher, the assay office where miners brought their silver to be evaluated, the general store owned by a Chinese immigrant who had come to work on the railroads and stayed to build a business. It's more civilized than I expected, Grace admitted as they rounded a corner onto a quieter residential street lined with small but well-kept houses. Getting more so all the time, Vance agreed. The mayor's wife started a ladies' literary society. Got a real doctor now instead of just the barber patching people up. Even talk of a proper theater next year. It sounds like a good place to live. He glanced down at her. Could be, for the right person. The implication hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly. They had reached the edge of town, where the neat row of houses gave way to open land and the looming shapes of mountains beyond. I should get you back to the hotel, Vance said after a moment. Early start tomorrow. Grace nodded, though she felt a distinct reluctance to end their walk. On the return journey, they spoke of lighter things, books they had read, places they had seen. Grace found herself laughing at Vance's dry observations about some of Silverdale's more colorful residents, while he listened with genuine interest to her stories of teaching in a Boston charity school before accepting the position out west. At the hotel steps, they paused. Thank you for the walk and the conversation, Grace said, suddenly shy. My pleasure. Vance hesitated, then added, Pikes Peak really will be getting a fine teacher. Thank you. Neither moved to leave, though propriety dictated they should part ways. Miss Thompson Grace, Vance finally said, his voice lower than before. I know you're set on Pikes Peak, and I've no right to suggest otherwise, but Silverdale needs a teacher too. The position pays less than Pikes Peak can offer, I'm sure, but... Are you asking me to stay? Grace interrupted, heart suddenly pounding. His green eyes held hers steadily. I'm suggesting you might consider it. The children here deserve someone like you, and the town. He paused. The town would welcome you. Just the town? Grace wondered but didn't voice the thought. It's a lot to consider on such short acquaintance, she said instead. Vance nodded, taking a step back. Of course. Forget I mentioned it. I shouldn't have presumed. I didn't say no, Grace said quickly. Only that it's a lot to consider. A hint of a smile returned to his face. Fair enough. Sleep well, Grace Thompson. Good night, Sheriff Vance. He waited until she was safely inside before turning away, and Grace watched through the window as he walked back toward the jailhouse, his figure straight and tall in the moonlight. She climbed the stairs to her room, mind whirling with unexpected possibilities. Could she really consider staying in Silverdale? She had signed a contract with the school board in Pikes Peak, had written to inform them of her acceptance and expected arrival date. Breaking that commitment would be unprofessional, potentially ruinous to her reputation as an educator. And yet, there was something about this town, about the man who protected it, that called to her in a way she couldn't easily dismiss. Grace slept fitfully, dreams filled with stagecoaches and gunshots and green eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed propriety to the woman underneath who longed for something more than she had allowed herself to want. Morning brought no clarity. Grace dressed carefully in her second-best traveling outfit, the blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and went downstairs to find the hotel abuzz with activity. The stagecoach passengers were gathered in the dining room, enjoying a substantial breakfast while discussing their impending departure. The repairs are progressing nicely, Mr. Peterson informed her as she joined them. We should be on our way by 1 o'clock. How wonderful, Grace replied automatically, though her enthusiasm felt hollow. After breakfast, she decided to explore the town in daylight. She told herself it was simply to stretch her legs before the long coach journey ahead, but she knew she was looking for reasons either to stay or to go. She wasn't sure which. Silverdale was indeed charming in the morning light. Children played in the schoolyard despite the lack of classes, their laughter carrying on the clear air. Women hung laundry and swept porches, calling greetings to each other across streets. Men went about their business with purpose, but without the frenetic pace of eastern cities. Grace found herself standing before the schoolhouse, a simple but well-constructed building with large windows and a small bell tower. The door was unlocked, and she stepped inside to find a single room with rows of desks, a teacher's desk at the front, and a blackboard mounted on the wall. Shelves held a surprising number of books for such a remote location, and a globe sat on a stand in one corner. Needs some attention, but it's got good bones. Grace turned to find Vance standing in the doorway, hat in hand. I didn't mean to intrude, she said quickly. The door was open. No intrusion, it belongs to the town, and you're a guest of the town. He stepped inside, looking around with evident pride. Built it myself, with help from some of the fathers, before the Silver Strike, when we were just a small settlement barely on the maps. You built this? He nodded. Carpentry was my father's trade. Taught me before the war. Figured the children deserved a proper place to learn, even out here. Grace ran her hand over the smooth surface of the teacher's desk, noting the careful craftsmanship. It's lovely. Children miss having a teacher. Last one left 6 months ago to get married. Town council's been looking, but good teachers are hard to find willing to come this far west. Grace met his gaze directly. And if one were to come, they'd be welcomed. He took a step closer. Especially if she happened to have auburn hair and courage enough to face down the Riker Gang. A flutter of something warm spread through Grace's chest. Sheriff Garrison, are you flirting with me? The corner of his mouth lifted. Trying to. Not very good at it, I expect. Been a while. The honesty of the admission touched her. I think you're doing just fine. They stood there, the air between them charged with possibility, until the church bell rang the hour, breaking the spell. I should get back to the hotel, Grace said reluctantly. The stagecoach will be leaving soon. Vance nodded, stepping aside to let her pass, but as she drew level with him, he spoke again. Grace, I know it's sudden and probably improper, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since yesterday. Grace's breath caught. I've been thinking about you too. Stay, he said simply. Not for me, we barely know each other, and I wouldn't presume, but stay for the school, for the children. Give Silverdale a chance. Give yourself a chance to know if this might be where you belong. And if I decide it isn't, then I'll personally escort you to Pike's Peak whenever you decide to go. The offer was generous, tempting in ways Grace hadn't expected when she'd boarded the train in Boston, seeking adventure and purpose. I have a contract, she said, the words feeling like an excuse rather than a reason. I understand. Just thought I'd ask. He stepped back, giving her space. Whatever you decide, I wish you well, Grace Thompson. She walked back to the hotel, mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The other passengers were already loading their luggage onto the repaired stagecoach when she arrived. There you are, Miss Thompson, Mrs. Higgins called out. We were beginning to worry. Just taking a final look at the town, Grace explained, moving toward the stairs to retrieve her trunk. I'll get that for you, madam, said the young deputy, Frank, appearing in the hotel doorway. Sheriff asked me to help with the luggage. Thank you, Grace said, leading him to her room where her trunk sat packed and ready. As the deputy carried her trunk downstairs, Grace took a last look around the small but comfortable room. Her gaze fell on the writing desk in the corner, where hotel stationery and a pen sat ready for guests' use. On impulse, she sat down and quickly penned a note, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her reticule before heading downstairs. The stagecoach was fully loaded, the passengers already boarding when Grace emerged from the hotel. Sheriff Garrison stood nearby, speaking with the driver but glancing in her direction as she approached. All set, Miss Thompson? The driver asked, reaching for her hand to help her board. Grace hesitated, looking at Vance, whose expression remained carefully neutral despite the intensity in his eyes. Actually, she said slowly, I find I'm not feeling quite well enough to travel today. I think I'll stay in Silverdale a while longer. Mrs. Higgins gasped in surprise. But my dear, what about your position in Pike's Peak? They're expecting you. Grace withdrew the note from her reticule. If you would be so kind as to deliver this to the school board there, explaining that I've been delayed due to unforeseen circumstances, I'll write more formally once I've recovered. Mrs. Higgins accepted the note with a puzzled expression that cleared as she glanced between Grace and the sheriff. I see, she said, a knowing smile spreading across her face. Well, I certainly hope you feel better soon, Miss Thompson. Thank you, Mrs. Higgins. Safe travels to you all. The other passengers called their goodbyes as the driver climbed up to his seat, and with a crack of the whip, the stagecoach rumbled out of town, leaving Grace standing alone with her decision. Vance approached slowly, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. You're staying? For now, Grace confirmed, to see if Silverdale might need a teacher as badly as I need a new adventure. His smile then was worth every moment of uncertainty. I believe it does, Miss Thompson. I believe it does. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Grace settled into Silverdale. Word spread quickly that the new schoolteacher had arrived earlier than expected and under dramatic circumstances, and townspeople stopped by the hotel regularly to introduce themselves and welcome her. Mrs. Winters insisted Grace continue staying at the hotel at a reduced rate until proper accommodations could be arranged, and the town council convened an emergency meeting to formally offer her the teaching position, which she accepted with certain conditions regarding books and supplies. Through it all, Vance maintained a respectful distance in public, though his eyes followed her whenever they were in the same room, and he found reasons to escort her on tours of the town and surrounding area, ostensibly for her safety and orientation. 2 weeks after her decision to stay, Grace officially opened the schoolhouse, welcoming 28 children of varying ages and educational backgrounds. The challenges were immense but rewarding. Some children had never held a book before, while others had been taught by parents with education of their own. Vance appeared at the schoolhouse door that first afternoon as the children were leaving, hat in hand, a bouquet of wildflowers awkwardly clutched in the other. "Thought you might need these to brighten up the place," he said, extending the flowers as the last child disappeared down the path. Grace accepted them with a smile, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "They're beautiful. Thank you." "How was the first day?" "Overwhelming, exhausting, and absolutely wonderful," she replied honestly, placing the flowers in a jar of water on her desk. "Did you know Tommy Jenkins can already read at a high school level? And little Sarah Miller has a remarkable aptitude for mathematics." Vance leaned against the doorframe, watching her arrange the flowers with a softness in his expression that made her cheeks warm. "Sounds like they've got the right teacher, then?" "I hope so." She straightened, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the schoolhouse. "Would you like to walk with me back to the hotel?" "I'd be honored." Their walks had become a daily ritual, gradually extending in length and ranging further from town as Grace's confidence in her surroundings grew. Today, they followed the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse, talking about the day's events and plans for the coming term. The town council mentioned building a small cottage for the teacher, Grace said as they paused on a footbridge spanning the creek. "Attached to the school." "I know," Vance replied. "I'm heading the construction committee." She glanced at him in surprise. "You didn't mention that." "Didn't want you to think I had ulterior motives." His smile was teasing but held a question. "And do you?" she asked boldly, surprising herself. "Probably." He turned to face her fully, the setting sun casting a golden glow over his features. "Grace, I know it's only been a few weeks, but I've never met anyone like you. The way you faced down Riker, how quickly you've taken to the town, the difference you're already making with the children." Grace's heart pounded as he took a step closer. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he continued, "but I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing. No pressure, no obligations, just a chance to see if what I'm feeling might be something you could feel too." "I already do," Grace admitted, the words escaping before she could consider their propriety. "Feel something, that is. For you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a storm. "May I call on you then? Sunday, perhaps? After church?" "I'd like that very much." They stood on the bridge as the sun sank lower, neither willing to end the moment, until the distant church bell reminded them of the hour. "I should get you back," Vance said reluctantly. "Mrs. Winters will worry." As they walked back toward town, his hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a rightness that made words unnecessary. Sunday came both too quickly and not soon enough. Grace dressed with special care in her best dress, a sage green that complemented her auburn hair, which she wore partially up with soft curls framing her face. Mrs. Winters fussed around her, offering advice and adjusting Grace's collar with maternal affection. "He's a good man," the older woman said as Grace prepared to leave for church. "Been alone too long. Deserves happiness." "We're only beginning to know each other," Grace reminded her, though her racing pulse belied her attempt at moderation. "Some things you know right away," Mrs. Winters said with the confidence of experience. "When my Henry walked into my father's store in Missouri, I knew that very day he was the man I'd marry." Sometimes the heart recognizes what belongs to it before the mind can catch up. Grace pondered those words as she walked to the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street. Vance was waiting outside, dressed in a clean black suit that made him look both more formal and somehow more approachable than his sheriff's attire. "Miss Thompson," he greeted her, offering his arm. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Sheriff Garrison," she replied with matching formality, though her smile gave away her pleasure at the compliment. "You look quite handsome yourself." They entered the church together, causing a ripple of whispers and smiles among the congregants already seated. Grace felt a moment of self-consciousness, but the genuine warmth in the townspeople's greetings soon put her at ease. The service was simple, but moving. The minister's sermon focused on building community and supporting one another through trials themes that resonated deeply after Grace's recent experiences. Throughout, she was acutely aware of Vance beside her, their shoulders occasionally touching when they stood for hymns. After the service, they accepted an invitation to Sunday dinner at the home of Mayor Davis and his wife, along with several other prominent citizens. The conversation flowed easily, with much discussion of the school's needs and plans for Silverdale's continued growth. "We're hoping to organize a proper Founders' Day celebration next month," Mrs. Davis announced as dessert was served. "Miss Thompson, we'd be honored if you'd help coordinate the children's participation. Perhaps a historical pageant or recitation?" "I'd be delighted," Grace replied, already mentally planning possibilities. "And Sheriff," the mayor added, "we'll need your help with security arrangements. Last year's celebration got a bit rowdy when some of the minors overindulged." "Of course," Vance agreed. Throughout the meal, Grace noticed how the townspeople naturally deferred to Vance on matters of importance, seeking his opinion not just on security issues, but on everything from the new road to expanding the general store. It was clear he was respected not merely as sheriff, but as a community leader whose judgment was valued. As the afternoon waned, Vance suggested they walk to the ridge overlooking town, a spot he claimed offered the best view of the sunset. They set off along a well-worn trail, the conversation between them growing more personal as they left the town behind. "Tell me about your family," Vance requested as they climbed. "You've mentioned your father, but what about your mother? Siblings?" Grace smiled, thinking of her family back east. "My mother passed when I was 15. Influenza. My father never remarried, focused instead on his shipping business and raising us. I have two younger brothers. William is studying law at Harvard, and Thomas is still in preparatory school, though he dreams of being an engineer. They must miss you." "They do. Father was against my coming west at first, but eventually understood it was something I needed to do." She glanced at him. "What about your family? You mentioned Virginia, but not much else." Vance was quiet for a moment, his expression distant. "Had two brothers and a sister. Lost my brothers at Gettysburg. They fought for the Confederacy while I chose the Union. Parents never forgave me for that. My sister married and moved to California before the war. Haven't heard from her in years." The pain in his voice was evident despite his matter-of-fact tone. Grace reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry." He returned the pressure. "It was a long time ago. Made my peace with it as best I could." They reached the ridge, and Vance was right. The view was spectacular. Silverdale lay below them, neat streets and buildings nestled in the valley, with mountains rising majestically beyond, and the setting sun painting everything in gold and rose. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed. "Yes, it is." But Vance wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at her. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place she hadn't known she was seeking. His lips were gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her hand rising to rest against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating as rapidly as her own. The kiss ended too soon, both of them pulling back slightly, aware of propriety even in this private moment. "I've been wanting to do that since I saw you step down from that stagecoach," Vance admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Even covered in dust and terrified?" Grace teased, trying to calm her racing pulse. "Especially then. You were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, facing down Riker like that." "I was paralyzed with fear. But you didn't show it. That's what courage is, being afraid but doing what needs doing anyway." They stood together as the sun sank below the mountains, Vance's arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. neither needing words to express the contentment of the moment. As autumn progressed into winter, Grace settled fully into life in Silverdale. The small teacher's cottage was completed before the first snow, providing her with a cozy home of her own attached to the schoolhouse. The town's women helped her furnish it, bringing quilts, curtains, and kitchen implements as welcoming gifts, while the men contributed practical items like firewood and tools. Her relationship with Vance developed steadily, their courtship conducted with a blend of propriety and genuine affection that soon became the town's favorite topic of gentle gossip. They attended social functions together, shared Sunday dinners with various townspeople, and continued their daily walks when weather permitted. In December, as Christmas approached, the town bustled with preparations for the holiday. The schoolchildren were practicing a nativity play, and Grace spent hours helping them memorize lines and create simple costumes. One afternoon, as she was placing pine boughs along the schoolhouse windows, Vance arrived with a small pine tree balanced on his shoulder. "Thought your cottage might need some Christmas cheer," he explained, setting the tree in a corner of her small sitting room. "It's perfect," Grace exclaimed, breathing in the fresh pine scent. "But I don't have any ornaments." "Got that covered too." He produced a small box from his coat pocket. "Town tradition. Every Christmas, each family makes a new ornament. These are from my collection over the years." Together, they decorated the tree with simple handmade ornaments, carved wooden stars, pine cones dipped in wax, paper angels carefully cut and painted. As they worked, Vance told stories about each piece, which year it was made, what was happening in Silverdale at the time. "And this one," he said, holding up a small wooden horse painted black with remarkable detail. "I carved last week, for this year." Grace accepted it carefully, admiring the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. Reminded me of that day on the ridge, how you looked sitting on my horse, sun in your hair, despite everything that had happened." He cleared his throat. "That was the day my life changed, Grace. The day you came into it." She placed the ornament carefully on a prominent branch, then turned to face him. "Mine changed too. I came west looking for purpose, but I found so much more." He took her hands in his. "Grace Thompson, I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I think I've loved you since I saw you crawl out from under that stagecoach, covered in dust but still holding your head high." Grace's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "I love you too, Vance. I didn't expect to find you here, but now I can't imagine my life without you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, visibly nervous as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my grandmother's. Sent back east for it, had it sized. Grace, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered, hardly able to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. "Yes, Vance, I will." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her. Vance drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise of their future together. The news of their engagement spread through Silverdale like wildfire, met with universal approval and excitement. The mayor's wife immediately began planning an engagement celebration, while Mrs. Winters wept happy tears and declared she'd always known they were meant for each other. That evening, curled together before the fire in Grace's cottage, with the door appropriately left open for propriety's sake, they discussed their future. "We could be married in the spring," Vance suggested, his fingers playing with a strand of her hair. "When the mountain passes clear. Your family could travel out for the ceremony." "I'd like that," Grace agreed, then hesitated. "Vance, about the school. I love teaching, and the children. I would never ask you to give that up," he interrupted firmly. "You're a born teacher, Grace. This town needs you in that classroom as much as I need you in my life." Relief washed through her. "Thank you. Some men wouldn't understand." I'm not some man. His smile was gentle. I want a partner, not a possession. As winter deepened, bringing snow that transformed Silverdale into a postcard-perfect mountain town, Grace wrote long letters to her family in Boston, describing her new home, her students, and most importantly, the man she had fallen in love with. Her father's reply was cautious but supportive, promising that he and her brothers would make the journey west for the spring wedding. Christmas in Silverdale was a community celebration unlike anything Grace had experienced in Boston. The entire town gathered in the church for services, then moved to the town hall for a feast where every family contributed dishes. Children performed Grace's carefully rehearsed nativity play, followed by carols led by the church choir. Vance presented Grace with a handcrafted bookshelf for her cottage, made from pine he had harvested and milled himself, while she gave him a fine leather-bound journal and fountain pen she had ordered from Denver, inscribed with his initials. For your thoughts, she explained as he ran his fingers over the embossing. You're always listening to everyone else's problems and concerns. I thought you might like a place for your own reflections. The kiss he gave her then, mindful of the public setting but still conveying deep emotion, left her breathless and more certain than ever that her impulsive decision to stay in Silverdale had been the best choice of her life. As the new year began, Grace and Vance settled into the rhythm of their engagement. The small diamond on her finger caught the light as she wrote on the blackboard, prompting giggles and whispered comments from her older female students, while the younger children peppered her with innocent questions about when she would become Mrs. Sheriff. Planning for the spring wedding proceeded, with Mrs. Davis and Mrs. Winters taking charge of arrangements while Grace continued teaching. Vance's duties as sheriff kept him busy, especially as improving weather brought more travelers through the area, not all of them law-abiding. In late February, news reached Silverdale that Luke Riker had escaped from the territorial prison where he had been held awaiting trial. Vance immediately increased patrols and warned Grace to be vigilant. He made threats against both of us during his imprisonment, Vance explained grimly as they sat before the fire in her cottage. Said he'd make us pay for what happened. Do you think he'd really come back here? Grace asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the chill of fear that ran through her at the thought of facing Riker again. I don't know. It would be foolish. He's recognizable, and every lawman in the territory is looking for him. But Riker was never known for his good sense. Vance squeezed her hand. Just be careful. Don't go anywhere alone, especially outside town. For the next 2 weeks, Vance or Deputy Frank escorted Grace between the school and her cottage, and she curtailed her usual walks. The precautions felt excessive until word came that Riker had been spotted in a settlement 30 miles away, headed in Silverdale's direction. I'm going out with a posse tomorrow, Vance told Grace one evening in early March. Frank will stay in town, and I've deputized 3 reliable men to keep watch. We'll try to intercept Riker before he gets anywhere near Silverdale. Grace tried to hide her fear, knowing Vance needed her support, not her worry. Be careful, please. Always am. He kissed her gently. Lock your doors tonight. I'll come by before we leave in the morning. That night, Grace slept poorly, dreams plagued by images of Riker's cold eyes and the feeling of his grip on her arm. She woke before dawn and was already dressed when Vance knocked softly on her door. He looked formidable in his sheriff's gear, rifle in hand, determination in his eyes. We're heading out now. Should be back by tomorrow evening at the latest. Grace straightened his bandana with trembling fingers. I'll be fine. The children will keep me busy. That's my brave girl. He kissed her, holding her tightly for a moment before reluctantly pulling away. I love you, Grace Thompson. I love you too. Come back to me. She watched from her doorway as Vance mounted his palomino and joined the 4 men waiting at the edge of town. He turned once, raising his hand in farewell, then they were gone, disappearing down the trail that led into the mountains. The day passed slowly. Grace going through the motions of teaching while her mind constantly wandered to Vance and the potential dangers he faced. The children sensed her distraction and were unusually subdued, even Tommy Jenkins refraining from his usual mischief. After dismissing class, Grace remained at the school preparing lessons for the following day, reluctant to return to her empty cottage where worries would be her only company. As dusk approached, she finally gathered her materials and headed home, nodding to one of the temporary deputies standing watch near the general store. Her cottage was cold and dark. Grace lit the lamps and stoked the fire, trying to create warmth and light to dispel the shadows of worry. She had just put the kettle on for tea when a soft knock came at her door. "Miss Thompson?" It was Frank's voice. "Just checking that you're all right." Relief flooded her as she opened the door. "Thank you, Frank. I'm fine. Just making some tea. Would you like some?" The young deputy shook his head. "No, madam, thank you. Just doing my rounds. Sheriff would have my hide if I didn't check on you regular like." "Any word from the posse?" "Not yet, madam, but that's to be expected. They'll likely camp overnight if they're tracking Riker into the high country." He touched the brim of his hat. "Lock up tight behind me." Grace did as instructed, then tried to occupy herself with reading, but found she couldn't concentrate. Eventually, she prepared for bed, hoping sleep would make the time pass more quickly until Vance's return. She had just extinguished the lamp when a noise outside caught her attention, a soft scraping at the back door that connected her cottage to the schoolhouse. Probably just the wind, she told herself, but reached for the small derringer Vance had insisted she keep in her bedside drawer. The scraping came again, more distinct this time, definitely not the wind. Grace slid silently from bed, the cool floor beneath her bare feet sending a shiver up her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Who's there?" she called, trying to make her voice sound stronger than she felt. Silence, then the unmistakable sound of the door latch being manipulated. Heart pounding, Grace moved to the window, intending to call for help, but as she reached for the sash, the glass shattered inward, forcing her to shield her face with her arms. A hand thrust through the broken pane, reaching for the latch. Grace stumbled back, raising the derringer. "I'll shoot." A harsh laugh answered her. "Go ahead, schoolmarm. One shot's all you got in that pea shooter, and there's two of us." She recognized the voice instantly, Luke Riker. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Grace forced herself to think clearly. The front door was still locked, but the back door's lock was being worked. The window was partially breached. Decision made, she ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock in the dark. Behind her, she heard the back door splinter open. She yanked the front door wide and burst out onto the porch, screaming as loudly as she could. "Help! Frank! Anyone!" A shot rang out from the direction of Main Street, followed by a shout. Grace ran toward the sound. Still in her nightgown, derringer clutched in her hand. "Frank!" she cried, seeing the young deputy running toward her, gun drawn. "Get inside the general store," he yelled, pointing to the brick building across the street whose windows still showed lamplight. Grace ran for it, bare feet slapping against the cold ground, aware of footsteps pounding behind her. She reached the store just as Mr. Chen, the owner, opened the door, alerted by the commotion. "Inside, quickly," he urged, pulling her through the doorway and immediately barring it behind her. Through the window, Grace saw Frank exchange gunfire with two men emerging from the shadows near her cottage. One fell, but the other, Riker, she was certain, returned fire. Frank staggered, clutching his arm, but remained standing. "Mr. Chen, Frank's hit," Grace said urgently. "Do you have a gun?" The shopkeeper nodded grimly, reaching beneath the counter to produce an old but well-maintained rifle. "Stay here. Hide in back room." Before she could protest, he slipped out the side door. Grace moved to the window, watching in horror as Riker advanced on the wounded deputy, gun raised for a killing shot. Mr. Chen's rifle cracked from the shadows beside the store. Riker spun, firing wildly in the direction of the sound. Another shot rang out from further down the street, one of the other deputies joining the fight. Riker, realizing he was outmatched, turned and ran, disappearing between buildings toward the livery stable. Frank sagged against a hitching post, still clutching his bleeding arm. Grace waited until Mr. Chen signaled that it was safe, then ran to Frank's side, tearing strips from her nightgown to bind his wound. "It's not bad, madam," the deputy assured her through gritted teeth. "Just a graze." "You saved my life," Grace told him, tying off the makeshift bandage. By now, much of the town was awake, men emerging from homes and businesses with guns, women appearing in doorways with lamps held high. The temporary deputies organized a search party while Mrs. Winters whisked Grace to the hotel, providing a robe to cover her torn nightgown and a strong cup of tea laced with whiskey to calm her nerves. "Riker's gone," reported one of the deputies an hour later. "Stole a horse from the livery. We found his partner dead outside Miss Thompson's cottage. It was Jed Simmons, one of Riker's gang who wasn't caught in the original roundup." "What about Sheriff Garrison?" Grace asked, clutching her teacup so tightly her knuckles showed white. "The posse?" "Sent a rider out at first light to find them, tell them what happened." The deputy hesitated. "Try not to worry, Miss Thompson. The sheriff can take care of himself." But Grace did worry, all through the long night and into the morning. She couldn't return to her damaged cottage, so she remained at the hotel, alternating between pacing the small sitting room and staring out the window toward the trail, where Vance had disappeared the previous day. Around noon, movement on that trail caught her attention, riders approaching at a gallop. Grace rushed outside, heedless of propriety in her borrowed clothes, straining to see if Vance was among them. 5 riders, then 6 as they drew closer. Vance in the lead, his face set in grim lines that softened the instant he saw her waiting. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, crossing the distance between them in long strides. "Grace, are you hurt?" His hands cupped her face, eyes scanning for any sign of injury. "No, I'm fine. Frank and Mr. Chen saved me." She leaned into his touch, the fear and tension of the night finally releasing in silent tears. "But Riker got away." "Not for long," Vance said, his voice hard. "We caught up with him 10 miles north of town. He's dead, Grace. He won't threaten you or anyone else ever again." Relief washed over her in a dizzying wave. Truly, truly, it's over. He pulled her close, uncaring of the audience they had attracted. "When we got word of what happened here, I've never ridden so hard in my life." That night, with Vance standing guard outside despite her protestations that it wasn't necessary with Riker dead, Grace slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time since learning of the Outlaws' escape. The following day, Vance and several men repaired the damage to her cottage, replacing the broken window and reinforcing both doors with stronger locks. While they worked, Grace sat on the schoolhouse steps with Mrs. Davis, finalizing wedding plans that now seemed more precious than ever. "We were thinking the first Saturday in May," Grace said, consulting the list in her hand. "My father and brothers will arrive the week before." "Perfect," Mrs. Davis agreed. "The wildflowers will be in bloom by then, and the weather should be mild." She patted Grace's hand. "After what you've been through, my dear, you deserve a beautiful wedding day." As the men finished their work, Vance approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "All done. Place is more secure than the jail now." "Thank you." Grace smiled up at him, shading her eyes against the spring sunshine. "For everything." That evening, alone in her repaired cottage, Grace wrote a long letter to her father, describing recent events but assuring him of her safety and happiness. As she wrote about Vance, his courage, his gentleness, his unwavering support, she realized how completely her life had transformed since that fateful day when outlaws had tried to drag her from the stagecoach. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed swiftly. Spring arrived in full force, turning the valley green and filling it with wildflowers. Grace's father and brothers arrived as promised. Thomas full of excitement about the adventure of traveling west, William more reserved but warming quickly to Silverdale's charms. Mr. Thompson, after an initial formal assessment of Vance that left both men slightly uncomfortable, declared himself satisfied with his daughter's choice. "He's a good man, Gracie," her father said privately after dinner at the hotel on their second night in town. "I can see why you love him." "He is, father. And I do. Very much." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for understanding. Your mother would have approved, I think," he added softly. "She always said you had a pioneer spirit, even as a little girl." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the union. The entire town turned out. The small church filled to capacity with additional chairs brought in from the schoolhouse to accommodate everyone. Grace stood in a side room, her brothers waiting to escort her down the aisle in their father's place, as he had been asked to give her away at the altar. Her gown, ordered from Denver, was simpler than what she might have worn in Boston, but perfectly suited to her new life cream-colored silk, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, a modest train flowing behind her. "You look beautiful, sis," William said, uncharacteristically emotional. "Sheriff Garrison is a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Grace replied, smoothing her veil. "Are you ready?" Thomas offered his arm with a flourish. "Your chariot awaits, my lady." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion for Grace. She would later remember isolated moments with perfect clarity, the look in Vance's eyes as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, the slight tremor in his hands as he placed the ring on her finger, the catch in his voice as he promised to love, honor, and protect her all the days of his life. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. "Sheriff Garrison, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and when they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Vance Garrison, the cheers and applause nearly lifted the church roof. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with tables set up along Main Street for a community feast, music provided by local musicians, and dancing that grew increasingly enthusiastic as the night progressed. "Happy, Mrs. Garrison?" Vance asked as they swayed together to a slow waltz, the lantern light casting a golden glow over the festivities. "Completely," Grace replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though I'm not sure I'll ever get used to that name." "You have a lifetime to practice," he murmured against her hair. Their new home, a surprise wedding gift from the town, stood on a small rise just outside Silverdale, close enough for Grace to walk to school each day, and for Vance to reach the jail quickly if needed, but offering privacy the cottage hadn't provided. It was larger than Grace had expected, with a proper parlor, a kitchen with a new cast-iron stove, 2 bedrooms, and a study where Vance could handle sheriff's business when necessary. "For your growing family," Mayor Davis had explained with a wink as he presented them with the deed during the wedding reception. That night, as Grace and Vance stood on the porch of their new home, watching the last of the celebration's lanterns being extinguished in town below, she felt a sense of completion she had never known before. "What are you thinking?" Vance asked, his arm around her waist. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be," she replied honestly. "With exactly who I'm meant to be with." His kiss was answer enough, and as he carried her across the threshold into their home, Grace knew that her greatest adventure was just beginning. 5 years later, Grace sat on that same porch, watching Vance teaching their 3-year-old son to ride his first pony in the yard. Michael James Garrison, named for both their fathers, had his mother's auburn hair and his father's green eyes, along with a fearlessness that frequently left Grace breathless with both pride and concern. "Not too fast," she called as the pony trotted around the yard, Vance keeping a firm hand on the lead rope. "He's fine," Vance assured her with a smile. "Got a natural seat, just like his mother." Grace laughed, recalling her own initial discomfort with horseback riding. A skill I acquired out of necessity, not natural ability. She shifted slightly, adjusting the weight of their second child, 4-month-old Elizabeth, who slept peacefully against her shoulder. The baby had arrived during the worst blizzard in recent memory, with Vance forced to deliver her himself when the doctor couldn't make it through the snow. It had been terrifying at the time, but now formed one of their favorite stories to tell about their daughter's dramatic entrance into the world. Silverdale had grown substantially in the 5 years since their wedding. The silver mines continued to produce, attracting more settlers and businesses. The school now had 2 rooms and a second teacher to help Grace, allowing her to spend more time with her children while still pursuing the profession she loved. Vance remained sheriff, though he now had 3 deputies instead of just 1, and spent more time on administrative duties than chasing outlaws. The railroad had finally reached them the previous year, bringing increased commerce but also new challenges for law enforcement. Through it all, their partnership had only strengthened. They faced each new development together, making decisions as a team, supporting each other through difficulties, and celebrating successes both personal and communal. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their property, Vance lifted Michael from the pony and set him on his shoulders, the boy's delighted giggles carrying across the yard. They approached the porch, Vance's eyes meeting Grace's with the same warmth and love that had been there from the beginning. "I think someone's ready for supper," he said, swinging Michael down to the porch steps. "Hungry?" the boy confirmed enthusiastically. Grace stood, cradling Elizabeth. "Everything's ready, just needs to be put on the table." As they moved inside, Vance caught her free hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that still sent a flutter through her heart after all this time. "Have I told you today how glad I am that you decided to stay in Silverdale?" he asked, his voice low and intimate despite the children's presence. "Not in so many words," she replied with a smile. "Best decision anyone ever made, shooting those Reins free and stopping that stagecoach." He kissed her softly. "Brought me everything I never knew I wanted." "It brought me home," Grace said simply, "where I was always meant to be." With Michael chattering excitedly about his pony ride and Elizabeth beginning to stir against her shoulder, Grace moved into the warm light of their kitchen, Vance following with a contented smile. Outside, the sun sank behind the mountains, ending another day in the life they had built together from an unexpected beginning, a life that had started with danger but had transformed into something more precious than either could have imagined when outlaws tried to drag her from that stagecoach until the cowboy shot the Reins free.